All right, hello again, Ling 441. We're going to move forward with Toby today. We're going to talk about intermediate phrases. And to get into that, I want to start with a little bit of review. We've talked already a little bit about intonational phrases, and we also talked last time about this phenomenon called downstepping. So we have specific words or syllables within, stress syllables within specific words, which get accented with pitch accents in the intonational system of English. We transcribe those with these H star or L star accents in the TOBI system. And we found out last time that when you produce an utterance, your F0 tends to drift downward as you go through from the beginning to the end in an intonational phrase. So this phenomenon is known as downdrift or downstepping. So you start out with like a big range and your high end can go pretty high. And then as you go, it kind of telescopes downwards and the range becomes smaller and the top end becomes lower. And so every single H star accent that happens after the first one has a tendency to be lower in F0 as you go. So usually this will reset when you produce another intonational phrase in the utterance. And that fact provides further evidence for the fact that there is phrasal organization when we produce intonation in a language like English. The trick to this, though, is that it's an optional process. So you can do this if you want, but you don't have to. You can keep emphasizing your H stars at the same level as you go throughout, as I'm trying to do right now. I don't know how well that worked. You can record this later and check the pitch track if you want. But if I do lower my F0 as I go, or if anybody does, then those downstep H star accents that come later in the intonational phrase are denoted with a exclamation mark H star in the TOBI system. So I'll give you an example, the one we heard last time.
Anna gave Manny a mango.
Ba, ba, ba. So on and so forth, kind of walking down the stair steps as we go. The first one is as high as it's reasonably going to get, so it's an H star, and there's nothing to give it context with, so it's always going to be an H star anyways. And if this one is lower, then you mark it or transcribe it with an exclamation mark in front of the H star. Same thing for the H star on mango.
Anna gave Manny a mango.
And I'll reiterate that again because this is a mistake or a common transcription mistake that a lot of beginners do, is that some people will transcribe this first H star with an exclamation mark in front of it. That doesn't work. If it's the first pitch accent in an intonational phrase, it's not going to be downstepped, right? The downstepping is just a relative feature of this H star in comparison to the initial H star or the one right before it. Okay, so enter intermediate phrases, another level of structure that we have to worry about. And intermediate phrases are a little bit controversial in the TOBI system. Some people believe they actually exist and some people don't. The official line is that they do exist, so I'm going to teach you about them. And one of the things that intermediate phrases are supposed to do is reset downstepping patterns. So when you get to the end of an intermediate phrase, which is not quite as big as an intonational phrase, you might start a new intermediate phrase, and then that downstepping F0 pattern can reset and you go back up to sort of the top of your pitch range. So I'll give you an example. This is from Mary Beckman's canned examples that came along with the original version of the TOBI handbook. And she says,
"It's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one."
I'll make that a little bit louder.
"It's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one."
So you can kind of think of an intermediate phrase as being like a comma pause, whereas an intonational phrase boundary was like a period pause. So it sort of sounds like a brief pause, but not that much of one. And where you get the sense of it here, well, you can maybe listen to this and tell me where in the middle here you might get sort of that intermediate level pause.
"It's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one."
And if you heard it the way Mary intended you to hear it, you should hear kind of a pause, more of a pause at this comma, not so much at this comma.
"It's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one."
And part of what's going on there, she's not only pausing a bit when she gets to the end of the word yellowish, but also there's this reset of the F0 pattern. So we have an H star on lovely, a downstepped H star on the first syllable of yellowish, and then there's kind of this dip in F0 and a bit of a pause which we're going to signify with this notation here. I'll explain that in a second. The important part to keep in mind for now is we kind of get a break here and then we reset so that when we get to an H star on old, it's back up again. It's going to be higher in F0 than what the H star, the downstepped H star we got for yellowish.
It's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one.
Yeah, so that is one of the things that intermediate phrases do. The other thing that we have to worry about with intermediate phrases is that they have boundary tones of their own, which are called phrase accents. So yeah, there's a couple of different notations that we have to worry about. So there's phrase accents, which again are going to be either low or high, and they're denoted with kind of a hyphen or a dash right after the L or H. So we get a third set of pitch types that we have to transcribe here. And then those will always align with a break index of 3. So intonational phrases had a break index of 4. We transcribe those with a percent sign after the H or the L. For intermediate phrases, they're one level down, so we're going to transcribe them with a break index of 3, and then the phrase accents themselves will have these little dashes after them. And the tricky part here is kind of the grammar of the system. So this is kind of a bare phrase, intermediate phrase boundary in the middle by itself, where it's, like I said, kind of a comma pause. So we have just the L dash phrase accent by itself. But then we have another one over here at the end. So before we've just been transcribing these kind of declarative intonation contours with like H star followed by a low boundary tone. The theory or the grammar of the TOBI system says that anywhere you have a boundary tone or an intonational phrase break, there's going to be an intermediate phrase break right before it, no matter what. So even if you don't hear this as sort of any different from this L% boundary tone, there's an L dash phrase accent right before it. And we'll hear different combinations of this so you can kind of get a better sense of what it sounds like when you have something different here. But there is kind of an LL pattern here, which is how I'm usually going to refer to it.
It's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one.
And that F0 pattern just kind of drops down to the bottom of the speaker's range when you get this L dash, L% sign combination at the end of an intonational phrase. Yeah, so you can have a bare phrase accent or by itself at the end of an intermediate phrase. You can no longer have a bare boundary tone just by itself. The boundary tone always has to come in conjunction with a phrase accent right before it. And you just have to figure out which one is the right one to choose for what you're hearing. Okay, so here's the F0 trace or pitch track for this utterance.
It's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one.
So the H star here is relatively high. Then we get a downstepped H star on yellowish. And then it bounces back up. Again, not quite as high as the initial one, but it's going to be higher, at least in the downstepped pitch accent on yellowish. But this H star on old,
it's lovely and yellowish, and it's an old one,
is a reset H star. So that gives us some evidence that we have an intermediate phrase accent or intermediate phrase boundary here in the middle. Okay, but basically this is what your TOBI transcription should look like for this utterance. I'm not going to say a whole lot about the break indices tier, except that we have a 3 here and we have a 4 here at the very end. Okay, so I'll give you some more examples. Like I said, there's a little bit of controversy about these things, whether or not they actually are real, but the tricky part is that they're often not that easy to hear. So that's why people kind of have doubt about them. But you should get, like I said, kind of a brief pause or a comma kind of sense of disjunction when you hear one. Here's a case where there is no intermediate phrase boundary in the middle of this entire utterance.
I means insert.
And you just kind of go all the way through.
I means insert.
And you can transcribe it like that with an H star on I, another H star on the second syllable of insert, because that's where the stress is.
I means insert.
And here we have an LL at the very end. Here's another example where there is an intermediate phrase boundary in the middle of the utterance.
I means insert. I means insert.
And maybe you get a sense of like a pause after the I here, maybe you don't. The way it's transcribed is with an H star on this I, like this H star, but to get that kind of quick drop to a low F0 that you hear after it is transcribed with an L dash phrase accent.
I means insert. I means insert.
Yeah. The rest of it is basically the same. And I've got this note here about the intermediate sense of disjuncture. So it's not like a complete stop, like full stop pause. You just get a little bit of a brief touch break, and then you keep moving on. I've got some examples here with low star accents rather than high stars.
Mariana made the marmalade.
There's no intermediate phrase boundary in the middle of that one.
Mariana made the marmalade.
But we do have L stars on Mariana and on marmalade.
Mariana made the marmalade.
So she's kind of bouncing down at the bottom. And those are the breaks. That's the transcription that breaks here. Here's an example where you do have an intermediate phrase boundary with an H dash phrase accent in the middle of this one. Let's see if you can hear it.
Mariana made the marmalade.
And again, that one goes through pretty quickly, so maybe you're not hearing the breaks so much as you're hearing sort of the change in the F0 contour.
Mariana made the marmalade.
So Mariana kind of winds up standing out a little bit more here because you have an H dash at the end of it. So the stressed syllable of Mariana is the third syllable, the A of the Anna part. That has a low star here.
Mariana made the marmalade.
But it bounces up really quickly after it. And if you get a sense of a pause here, that's an H dash. Both of these examples, by the way,
Mariana made the marmalade. Mariana made the marmalade.
Have that rising F0 contour at the tail end. So what we're hearing there is H dash H percent sign combo at the end in HH, which is how we're going to transcribe that sort of question rise, that yes, no question rise we've been talking about before.
Mariana made the marmalade. Mariana made the marmalade.
I guess if I was actually doing this the right way, I would put question marks at the end of this because why not? So after several years of not realizing that was not the best way to write that out, I will change it. Okay, so hopefully you get a sense of that. Like I said, it's a little bit tricky. Most of what I would rely on is trying to get a sense of whether or not you hear that sort of brief pause in the middle of an utterance to transcribe a phrase accent to go along with it, or an intermediate phrase boundary. This is what I'm calling a chunking review. This is kind of the syntax of how Toby is supposed to work. So we know all the different levels of sort of structure underneath an entire utterance, which is the longest thing you can possibly say. So within any given utterance, there has to be at least one intonational phrase. It's possible there can be only one intonational phrase, and so the whole intonational phrase is the whole utterance itself, like I means insert, or what have you. But you can make a pause within an utterance and then start again with another intonational phrase, and you keep going as long as you want indefinitely, right? That's how syntax tends to work. It goes to the infinite. Same thing for within an intonational phrase. You can have more than one intermediate phrase within that intonational phrase, but you have to have at least one. So this is kind of why we're transcribing a phrase accent right before every boundary tone now, is there has to be an intermediate phrase within the intonational phrase according to the grammar of the system. Every intermediate phrase has to have at least one pitch accent in it. The last one is technically known as the nuclear accent, so I've just got that bolded here because there has to be at least a nuclear accent in your intermediate phrase, and there might be more pitch accents before that. Whenever you do have a pitch accent or the nuclear accent itself, they're always aligned with stressed syllables in the utterance, or stressed syllables in a particular word. This is how the grammar is supposed to work. So when you do come up with transcriptions in Toby, make sure it adheres to this system, right? Make sure that you're not transcribing something which is grammatically impossible according to these strictures of the Toby grammar. Yeah, and hopefully that makes sense, but we'll work on a few examples to kind of get the hang of it as we go. Okay, just so you know, at the break indices level, now that we know the various levels of sort of grammatical structure and an intonation transcription, we have, it turns out, 5 different levels of disjuncture that we can transcribe, ranging from 0 to 4. We've already seen 4. So 4 is going to mark boundaries between intonational phrases. And these are always associated with a boundary tone, like H percent sign or low percent sign. And they give you a sense of complete disjuncture. Like I said, you can think of it as like a period stop in the utterance itself. Right beneath that, we get the 3-level boundaries, which mark the breaks between intermediate phrases. They always have to line up with a phrase accent, like H dash or L dash. Yeah, and I guess I'll go back up here for a second. The 4 is now always going to, they have to be associated with or lined up with a boundary tone, but the boundary tone is always going to have a phrase accent in front of it. We don't, for whatever reason, wind up transcribing these with like 3, 4, and then like a phrase accent boundary tone. It's just 4, and it's going to have a phrase accent and a boundary tone in conjunction at the end. And I'll show you some more examples here before we're done today. Anyways, going back to this, the 3 boundaries are sort of the comma level pauses between intermediate phrases, if you get them. So they are a lesser sense of disjuncture. We've seen as well the lower levels of this. So 1 will mark a boundary between words, and you may not hear any sort of sense of disjuncture at all between those. And you probably won't. If you do, you're going to probably have to transcribe it as 3 or 4, basically. Because as we know from acoustic phonetics, that when we speak, our words just kind of run into each other. They don't have to take a break for you to figure out what they are. At least if you speak the language well. So a 0 marks non-boundaries between words, is what I'm calling them, but they're actually sort of bleeding into each other across word boundaries, where you get clear co-articulation at the segmental level between words. And then everybody always asks, what is the 2 for? And the answer is not really that much that you're going to have to worry about in this class, because it is used basically if there's confusion or if things don't seem to line up properly in the utterance that you're hearing. So 2 is supposed to mark if you're uncertain about a transcription, or if there's an apparent mismatch between levels, like if you're hearing sort of a complete sense of disjuncture in the middle of a utterance where you're not getting sort of some sort of clear boundary tone to go along with it, or something like that, where say perhaps a person just doesn't know exactly what they're going to say next, so they stop kind of in the middle of their intonational plan. I'll just say this is rarely used. If you are not sure if something seems really wildly wrong to you, you can always throw it in there. I'm not really going to count off for any of your transcriptions, but I'm just mentioning it so you know that it's there. Primarily, we just have to worry about these first 4, and that's what I'm kind of get on your case about, because these, you should know how they work according to the rules of the system. Okay, like I said, every boundary tone is now going to come with a phrase accent in front of it, and there's 4 possible combinations, since both phrase accents and boundary tones can be high and low. So we've seen 2 of these already. The basic pattern for declarative sentences is where you get a low-low combo. And I've got Bruce Hayes saying the name Amelia with at least 3 of these combinations.
Amelia.
Yeah, so that one just, the F0 kind of goes down at the end, and it just bottoms out.
Amelia.
That's a low-low pattern that we typically get for declarative sentences. For yes-no questions, we get sort of the opposite, a high-high combo.
Amelia.
Yeah, like, did you know that Amelia won first prize in the competition?
Amelia?
Yes, Amelia. Right, so we can also hear a couple other examples of that.
Does Manitowoc have a bowling alley?
Or,
My name is Mariana.
yeah, this one's
My name is Mariana.
a bit of an uptalk pattern, but I'll say more about that in a second. I'll also say a little bit more about this funny example.
Does Manitowoc have a bowling alley?
So for those of you who don't know, and there's no reason you should know, but Manitowoc is a city, or a small city in Wisconsin on Lake Michigan, and I think it was included in these examples because it has 4 Manitowoc. Yeah, it has 4 syllables and has stress on the first and the last, Manitowoc. Yeah, so that's kind of a funny stress pattern. And many years ago, almost 10 years ago now, it turns out Manitowoc is special for another reason, because there is actually a ferry you can take across Lake Michigan. The town on the other side is Ludington, Michigan, and then Manitowoc is on the Wisconsin side. So once upon a time, I drove all the way out to Ottawa and decided to go through sort of the northern states to get there, and I took that ferry from Manitowoc to Ludington, and I posted a picture of myself getting on board the ferry because it was kind of a special moment. And my phonetics friends on Facebook said, well, hey, does Manitowoc have a bowling alley? And it turns out that it does, but I did not go play because I had to get to Michigan. So anyways, just so you know, the other two possible combinations for phrase accents and boundary tones, there's one that's called a continuation rise.
Amelia.
And that's a low dash followed by a high percent sign. So you kind of dip down for the phrase accent and then come up a little bit for that final boundary tone.
Amelia.
So it's a rise at the end, but it's not as dramatic as this rise.
Amelia.
And to be honest, this is kind of more the pattern you tend to hear for like the uptalk pattern, although that can vary. But maybe this last one here.
My name is Mariana.
Is a bit more of a low high rise rather than a big up swooping HH.
Amelia.
And lastly, there's kind of a funny one, which is H-L percent sign, a high phrase accent followed by a low boundary tone. This one actually kind of doesn't really go anywhere. It's just a plateau pattern.
My name is Mariana.
And you hear this in, say, examples where people are providing lists of things that they want to talk about. Here's Mary Beckman saying,
Oh, I don't know. It's got oregano and marjoram and some fresh basil.
And it just kind of flattens out at the tail end, which is why it's called a plateau pattern. But you can think of like, well, what are you going to do on your summer vacation? Oh, we're going to go to the beach. We're going to go mini golfing. We're going to go to the cabin. We're going to go out and have some drinks and so on and so forth and whatever. Okay, so that's where you get H-L percent signs. They're not quite as common as for these other three, but they're out there. So keep an eye out or an ear out for them. This also leads me to this one other phenomenon I should talk about, which is the idea of upstep, which kind of makes for what sounds like a nice sort of symmetrical pattern with downstepping, but it's actually totally different. So it can be confusing, but the idea with upstep in Toby is that boundary tones after an H phrase accent are going to be higher than normal. It's going to push the entire sort of pitch range up to another level. Which is why you get this weird effect of an H-L star, not kind of going down like that, but actually just flattening out. So after these H dashes, the L percent is going to be a lot higher than normal, and the H percent is going to be a lot higher than normal. So I'll give you some examples from what we just heard.
My name is Mariana. My name is Mariana.
So this one is supposed to be HH, and the F0 just kind of pops up at the tail end. And for the H-L percent sign, it just flattens out rather than popping down. So that's supposed to be upstep. And I'm not going to say much more about that other than you just have to worry about how to identify these patterns when you hear them in the examples we're going to transcribe together. Okay, so that's it for the boundary tone combos and intermediate phrases, and we're just going to work on some practice for this because again they take a little while to get used to. So you can go to the home page again and we can work on Toby Lab number 3. I've got it linked up here, and this is it here. I've got the examples from the lecture, and then we're going to work on these 6 utterances together. So have at her and we'll figure out what's going on. Okay.